Where did my parents go? My mom didn't answer when I called about dinner. When Dad's phone went straight to voicemail too, I drove to their house to check on them. Their cars were in the driveway, but nobody answered the door. I used my key and found everything exactly as it always was. Coffee cups in the sink from breakfast, and my mom's reading glasses on the kitchen counter. Their phones were on the dining room table, both dead. My chest tightened with the wrongness of it all. Their bedroom looked normal with the bed made and clothes in the closet. Nothing was missing that I could tell. Their suitcases were in the basement and their passports were in the drawer where they always kept them. My dad's wallet was on his dresser with all his cards and $300 cash inside. Nobody leaves their wallet unless something terrible happened to them. I called the police and they sent someone over who walked through the house and said there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. He said adults are allowed to leave without telling anyone. When I explained that my parents would never just vanish, he shrugged and said to call back if they didn't return in 48 hours. I wanted to scream at him that something was obviously wrong. My mom was supposed to work that day, and when I called her office, they said she hadn't shown up or called in sick. My dad's construction site said the same thing. Neither of them had ever missed work without notice in their entire careers. The fear was making it hard to breathe. I went through their computers and found nothing unusual. No strange emails or messages. Their social media hadn't been touched in days. The last text my mom sent was to me 3 days earlier about a recipe she wanted to try. Everything in their digital life just stopped at the same moment. The neighbors hadn't seen anything unusual. My parents' best friends hadn't heard from them. Nobody at their gym or church or book club knew anything. It was like they'd just evaporated in the middle of their normal routine without telling a single person. After 48 hours, the police took a missing persons report, but said there was no evidence of foul play. They suggested my parents might have needed a break from their lives. When I told them my parents had been happily married for 30 years and loved their jobs, they said you never really know what's going on. I wanted to throw something at the detective's dismissive face. I found their cell phone bill and checked the last calls. Nothing unusual except for one number I didn't recognize from the night before they disappeared. When I called it, I got a disconnected message. The phone company said the number had never existed in their system, which made no sense because it was right there on the bill. My hands were shaking as I hung up. Their bank accounts hadn't been touched. No credit card activity. Their medications were still in the bathroom cabinet, including my dad's heart pills that he needed daily. The refrigerator was full of fresh groceries with receipts from 2 days before they vanished. They'd bought ingredients for a week. I stayed at their house hoping they'd come back. Every time a car drove by, I ran to the window. After a week, I went back to work in my own apartment, but I stopped by every day. The police detective assigned to the case said he'd seen situations like this before, where people just decided to start over. I told him my parents would never abandon me without a word. He said trauma could make people do unexpected things, but when I asked what trauma, he just shrugged and closed the file. 3 weeks passed with nothing. I hired a private investigator who found no trail. He said it was like they'd been professionally disappeared, but without any of the usual reasons. They had no debts or enemies or secrets he could find. Just a normal couple who'd vanished from their normal life. Then I noticed something odd in their house. A photo album I'd looked through 100 times as a kid was missing several pictures from summer 1999 when I was 2. The empty spaces were obvious with the little corner holders still there. My mom would never have removed photos from her albums, and my skin crawled wondering who had. I found their safety deposit box key and went to the bank. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, including adoption papers with my name on them. But the adoption agency listed didn't exist when I searched for it. The address was a parking lot that had been there for 30 years according to city records. Everything I thought I knew about myself was crumbling. The birth date on my adoption certificate was different from the one I'd always celebrated by 3 months. When I called the hospital where I was supposedly born, they had no record of me under either date. The Social Security office said my number was issued when I was 5, not as a baby like it should have been. None of this made any sense, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I was going through their closet again looking for anything I'd missed when I found a business card tucked into a jacket pocket. It was completely blank except for a phone number. When I called it, a woman answered and said, "We've been waiting for you to find this number." I asked who she was, and she said she knew where my parents were. But first I needed to understand something. She said, "The people you call your parents aren't who you think they are, and neither are you." Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. My hands dropped the phone, and I stood there in my parents' kitchen, unable to move or think clearly. The woman hung up before I could ask anything else, and the dial tone buzzed in my ear for several seconds before I remembered to breathe. I called Gilbert immediately and told him what just happened, my words tumbling out so fast I had to repeat myself twice. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes and told me not to call that number again until we figured out who we were dealing with. I paced through the house, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt like props in a staged life. The coffee cups in the sink and the reading glasses on the counter and even the family photos on the walls looked different now, like evidence of an elaborate lie instead of memories. Gilbert arrived with a recording device and a notepad, and we sat at the kitchen table planning exactly what to say when I called Adeline back. He wrote out questions in careful order, starting with proof of life and moving towards specifics about the adoption and my parents' disappearance. We practiced the conversation 3 times until I could keep my voice steady, even when asking about my own fabricated identity. Gilbert set up his recording equipment and checked the levels twice before nodding at me to make the call. I dialed the number with shaking fingers and Adeline answered on the first ring like she'd been sitting there waiting. Her voice sounded exhausted rather than threatening, and I could hear traffic noise in the background like she was calling from outside somewhere. I told her I needed proof my parents were alive before I'd discuss anything else, and there was a long pause filled with distant car sounds. She said she'd see what she could arrange, but it might take time because the people involved were very careful about communication. I asked what people and why all the secrecy, and she said my parents' safety depended on everyone following certain rules. I pressed her about what rules and why my parents needed protecting, and she explained that the adoption network they used in 1999 was looked at by investigators, and anyone connected to it was potentially at risk. My stomach clenched as I realized she was talking about my adoption specifically, and that whatever my parents had done to get me was serious enough that people were still investigating it 25 years later. Adeline's voice got quieter as she told me the agency that processed my adoption was actually a front for gray market placements. She said they matched babies from desperate situations with parents willing to pay and not ask too many questions about where the children came from. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest as I understood that my parents had essentially bought me from people who were trafficking children. Everything about my origin story was manufactured to hide illegal activity, and I didn't even know who I really was, or where I'd actually come from. My birth certificate was fake, and my birthday was fake, and probably even my original name was something different that nobody remembered anymore. Gilbert was watching my face carefully, and he reached across the table to squeeze my hand as Adeline kept talking. I managed to ask how she knew all this and why she was telling me now, and Adeline admitted she'd been a courier for the network back then. She said her job was delivering paperwork and payments between the people running the operation and the families who were adopting. She got out years ago when she realized how wrong it all was, but recent investigations had brought old contacts back into her life. People were asking about my parents and their adopted daughter, and she'd felt obligated to warn us, even though reaching out put her at risk too. Her voice cracked slightly when she said she'd delivered the papers for my adoption and remembered my parents because they'd seemed so happy and desperate, and she'd felt guilty about it ever since. Gilbert leaned toward the phone and asked who was investigating and what agency they were with, but Adeline refused to give names. She said she was already risking too much by talking to us, and that the people involved had ways of finding out who was sharing information. I begged her to at least try to get proof my parents were alive, and she promised she'd see what she could do before hanging up abruptly. The line went dead and Gilbert stopped the recording while I sat there trying to process what I'd just learned. My parents had knowingly participated in illegal adoption, and then built my entire identity on lies, and I didn't know how to reconcile that with the loving family I thought I'd grown up in. Gilbert looked at my face and reminded me that people do desperate things when they want children badly enough. He said my parents had clearly loved me regardless of how I came into their lives, and that their choice to disappear was probably about protecting me from whatever consequences might come from the investigation. I wanted to believe him, but I felt betrayed and angry and confused about who I was supposed to be now that I knew the truth. We sat in silence for several minutes before Gilbert suggested we go through my parents' financial records to see if we could find evidence of the payments Adeline mentioned. He said documentation would help us understand what really happened, and might give us leverage to get more information from the authorities. Over the next week, I went through every financial document in my parents' house, looking for large unexplained withdrawals or payments from 1999. I found old checkbook registers and bank statements in boxes in the basement and spread them across the dining room table in chronological order. My father's construction business account showed several cashier's checks made out to cash totaling nearly $40,000 in the months before my supposed adoption. The amounts were large enough to notice, but spread out enough that they wouldn't trigger automatic bank reporting requirements. I photographed each statement and register entry and created a timeline matching the payments to the dates on my fake adoption certificate. The paper trail was clear and damning, and I felt sick looking at the evidence that my parents had paid that much money for me. Gilbert took the information and used a contact at the bank to get copies of the actual cashier's check transaction records, even though the branch that issued them had closed in 2003. The checks were purchased on specific dates that lined up perfectly with the timeline on my adoption certificate, creating an undeniable connection between the payments and my placement. We had proof that money changed hands, and that my parents had participated knowingly in whatever illegal operation Family Connection Services was running. Gilbert organized everything into a folder with tabs and summaries and said it was time to take this evidence back to Detective McCormick and demand he take the case seriously. I made an appointment at the police station and brought the folder of financial evidence, hoping it would finally change McCormick's mind about investigating. He looked through the documents carefully, and I watched his expression for any sign that he understood the significance of what we'd found. But when he finished reading, he just shrugged and said, "Financial transactions from 25 years ago didn't prove my parents were in danger now." He suggested I was building a wild theory out of normal adoption expenses and my own worry about their disappearance. I wanted to scream at him that $40,000 in cash payments wasn't normal and that the adoption agency didn't even exist, but he'd already made up his mind that this wasn't worth his time. Gilbert and I left the police station, and I was so frustrated I could barely speak. He told me we needed to find other victims or witnesses from the same adoption network to establish a pattern of fraud. He said if we could prove this was organized criminal activity affecting multiple families, then law enforcement would have to take it seriously, regardless of McCormick's personal opinion. We sat in his car outside the station and started planning how to search for other people who might have used family connection services for adoptions around the same time I was placed. Gilbert said there had to be records somewhere, and other families who were dealing with the same questions I was, and that finding them was our best chance at getting real answers about what happened to my parents and who I really was. I went home that night and opened my laptop and started searching for anything about gray market adoptions in our state during the late 1990s. The results were buried under pages of legitimate adoption resources, but I kept digging and finally found a series of news articles from 2001 about investigations that had gone nowhere. One article mentioned a nonprofit called Family Connection Services that was shut down for financial irregularities, and my hands froze on the keyboard when I saw the address listed. It was the exact same parking lot address from my adoption papers. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Gilbert, and he called me back within minutes and said this was the break we needed. He told me he knew a journalist who had covered adoption fraud cases back then, and that he'd reach out to see if she remembered anything about Family Connection Services. I barely slept that night because my mind kept spinning through all the possibilities of what my parents had been involved in. The next morning, Gilbert called and said the journalist's name was Isolde West, and that she'd agreed to meet with us at a coffee shop downtown that afternoon. I got there early and sat at a corner table watching the door, and when Gilbert arrived, he had a woman with him carrying thick folders under her arm. Isolde looked to be in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that took in everything about me before she even sat down. She spread the folders across the table and told us Family Connection Services was suspected of facilitating illegal placements, but the investigation collapsed when key witnesses disappeared or recanted their statements. Her fingers traced over old notes and newspaper clippings as she explained how the nonprofit had connections to family court judges and social workers, who would expedite paperwork and seal records to hide where the children actually came from. She said at least 30 families were involved, but most refused to cooperate with investigators because they feared losing their children or facing criminal charges themselves. I asked if she remembered any names from her investigation, and she flipped through her notes slowly, and then showed me a list of people connected to Family Connection Services. My father's name wasn't on the list, but I recognized the name of his former construction company as a donor to the nonprofit, and my stomach dropped. Gilbert leaned forward and asked Isolde what happened to the investigation, and she said it just died when the key witnesses stopped talking, and the nonprofit dissolved. We spent 3 hours at that coffee shop while Isolde walked us through everything she'd learned 20 years ago, and I could tell she was excited to revisit a case that never got proper closure. She offered to help us investigate if we were willing to share information, and potentially go public with whatever we found, and Gilbert and I agreed immediately without even looking at each other. Isolde packed up her folders and gave us her contact information, and told us to call her anytime, and that she still had sources who might be willing to talk now that enough time had passed. I drove home feeling like we finally had a real lead, and someone who understood what we were dealing with. That evening I was making dinner when my phone rang from an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My mother's voice said my name and then told me she loved me, and the line went dead before I could say anything back. I started crying and shaking, and I called back immediately, but got a message saying the number was disconnected, just like the impossible number from their phone bill. I called Gilbert and he came over right away, and I played the voicemail for him over and over while he listened carefully. He said my mother sounded strained and like she was reading from a script, and that this was proof of life, but also suggested my parents were being controlled or monitored. He told me our investigation might be putting them in more danger, but that we couldn't stop now because we were too close to finding answers. The next day, Adeline called me and asked if I'd received proof my parents were alive, and I told her yes, but that it wasn't enough because I needed to know where they were and why they left. She said she couldn't tell me their location, but that they went into hiding when they learned someone was looking into old adoption records and asking about families who used Family Connection Services. I demanded to know who was investigating and whether it was law enforcement or someone more dangerous, and Adeline hesitated before saying it was complicated because multiple parties were interested for different reasons. She explained that some people wanted to expose the adoption fraud, while others wanted to protect themselves from prosecution, and my parents were caught in the middle because of what they knew. Gilbert took the phone from me and asked Adeline what my parents knew that made them valuable enough to disappear over. She said they could identify the people who ran Family Connection Services and facilitated the illegal placements, and she admitted that several families had already been contacted by investigators, and that anyone who cooperated faced potential legal consequences for their role in the fraud. My hands grip the phone tighter, and I feel heat rising in my chest because my parents chose to run away instead of dealing with the mess they created. I tell Adeline this whole situation isn't fair to me, and that I'm the one paying the price for choices they made before I could even talk. She goes quiet for several seconds, and I can hear her breathing on the other end. Then she says something that makes my stomach drop. She tells me my parents didn't disappear just to protect themselves from prosecution. They left because someone contacted them and threatened to challenge my adoption legally, and take me away if they cooperated with any investigation into the old network. I stop breathing for a second because that doesn't make sense. I'm 27 years old and nobody can just take me away like I'm property. But Adeline keeps talking and explains that adoption fraud cases can be reopened even decades later, and that my biological origins are completely unknown. She says if the adoption gets voided in court, I have no legal claim to my current identity, because there's no record of who I actually am or where I came from. The room starts spinning and I grab the edge of my kitchen counter to steady myself. My social security number was issued when I was 5. My birth certificate is fake. The hospital has no record of my birth. If someone challenges the adoption and wins, I could lose everything, including my legal right to exist as the person I've always been. My chest gets tight and I can't get enough air and my vision starts going dark around the edges. Gilbert must see something wrong because he crosses the room fast and takes the phone from my hand. I hear him asking Adeline specific questions about who made the threats and what legal basis they have for challenging adoptions this old. His voice sounds far away, even though he's standing right next to me. Adeline tells him she doesn't know the person's identity, but that they've been contacting families from the old network over the past few months. The person demands money or cooperation in exchange for not reporting the families to authorities who could reopen their cases. Gilbert asks how much money and Adeline says it varies, but some families have paid tens of thousands of dollars to make the threats stop. He asks if she knows how many families have been contacted, and she estimates at least a dozen that she's aware of, but there could be more. Gilbert thanks her and ends the call, and I'm sitting on my apartment floor now, though I don't remember getting down here. My breathing comes in short gasps, and Gilbert kneels beside me, telling me to breathe slowly and count to 4. He pulls out his phone and calls someone, and I hear him say Isolda's name. He puts the call on speaker, and Isolda's voice fills my small apartment, asking what's wrong. Gilbert explains the extortion angle and how someone is threatening families from the old adoption network. Isolda goes quiet for a moment and then says, "This changes everything because it means there's an active criminal element beyond just historical fraud." She says law enforcement should finally get interested now that there's ongoing criminal activity, and not just old paperwork irregularities. Gilbert asks what she thinks we should do next, and Isolda suggests we document everything we have and approach the state attorney general's office instead of relying on local police who might have conflicts of interest. She offers to write an article about the adoption fraud and the current extortion scheme if we can provide enough corroborated evidence. She thinks public pressure will force official action even if authorities want to keep ignoring the situation. I finally get my breathing under control, and Gilbert helps me stand up. Over the next few days, I work with Gilbert and Isolda to organize all our evidence into a timeline that makes sense. We spread everything across my living room floor and start building a case. We have the financial records showing my father's cashier's checks from 1999. We have my fake adoption papers with the non-existent agency address. We have the sealed court orders that Isolda got copies of years ago during her original investigation. We have her old notes about family connection services and the other families who use the network. We have recordings of our conversations with Adeline that establish the ongoing extortion scheme. Gilbert creates a digital database with scanned copies of everything and timestamps showing when we obtained each piece of evidence. Isolda writes a draft article but holds off on publishing until we have more corroboration. I go back to my parents' house to search for anything else that might help, and I'm going through boxes in their basement when I find my father's old day planner from 1999. The leather cover is worn and the pages are yellowed, but his handwriting is still clear. I flip through the months and find notations about meetings with someone he only identifies by initials. RM appears on several dates throughout the spring and summer of 1999. I cross-reference the dates with the cashier's check purchases from the bank records, and they match up almost perfectly. Every time my father met with RM, he bought a cashier's check within a few days. I take photos of the relevant pages and text them to Gilbert. He calls me back within minutes and says this could identify one of the people who ran Family Connection Services if we can figure out who RM was. I spend the rest of the afternoon searching through more boxes, but don't find anything else with those initials. My phone rings 2 days later and it's a number I don't recognize. When I answer, a man's voice asks if this is about Family Connection Services, and I say yes. He tells me his name is Henri, and that he was my father's construction foreman back in the late 90s. I'd left him several messages asking about the company's connection to the nonprofit. Henry sounds nervous and says he doesn't want to talk on the phone, but he'll meet me at a diner on the east side of town. I agree immediately, and he gives me the address and says he'll be there in an hour. I call Gilbert and he says he'll meet me there. When I arrive at the diner, Henri is already sitting in a back booth, and he looks older than I expected with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. He keeps checking the door like he's worried someone followed him. I slide into the booth across from him and he orders coffee when the server comes by. His hands shake slightly as he lifts the cup. He tells me he remembers my father getting involved with a nonprofit that was supposed to help place foster kids with families. The construction company made several large donations as tax write-offs, and Henri thought it was legitimate charity work. But then one day he overheard my father arguing on the phone in the job site trailer. My father was talking about payments and paperwork and saying something wasn't what they'd agreed to. After that conversation, my father stopped mentioning the nonprofit entirely and got angry if anyone brought it up. Henry says he didn't think much about it at the time because it wasn't his business, But now with all these years past, he wonders what was really going on. I pull out my phone and show him the photos of my father's day planner with the RMR initials. I ask Henri if he knows who that might be. His face goes completely pale and he sets his coffee cup down carefully. He admits he met a man named Ramon once who came to the construction site to talk to my father privately. Henri describes Ramon as well-dressed in an expensive suit and driving a luxury car that looked out of place in the dirt parking lot. Ramon made it clear he wasn't used to visiting construction sites or getting his shoes dirty. He talked to my father for about 20 minutes in the trailer, and when they came out, my father looked upset and stressed. Henri never saw Ramon again after that day, but he remembers thinking the guy seemed intimidating in a way that made Henri glad he wasn't involved in whatever business they were discussing. I drive straight to Gilbert's office after leaving the diner and find him already at his computer pulling up databases. He types in Ramon and starts filtering by nonprofit connections in our state during the late 1990s. The search takes about 20 minutes while I pace behind his desk and watch the screen populate with results. Gilbert narrows it down to 3 men named Ramon, who had any connection to family services or adoption organizations during that time period. The first 2 seem like dead ends with minimal involvement, but the third one makes Gilbert sit up straighter in his chair. Ramon Mercado was listed as a director for Family Connection Services and also held positions with 2 other similar organizations that were all shut down within a few years of each other. Gilbert clicks through the records and shows me that each organization was closed due to financial violations and irregular record keeping. He prints everything out and adds it to the growing file of evidence we've been building. I call Detective McCormick and tell him we need to meet immediately because we've identified someone who ran the adoption network. McCormick sounds annoyed but agrees to see us at the station in an hour. When we arrive at the police station, McCormick is waiting in an interview room with his arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Gilbert spreads out all our evidence on the table, including Henri's statement about meeting Ramon, the financial records showing my father's payments, the fake adoption paperwork, and now the background check showing Ramon Mercado's connection to multiple fraudulent nonprofits. McCormick picks up each document and reads through them slowly, and I watch his expression change from dismissive to actually interested. He tells us Ramon Mercado's name appears in multiple fraud investigations from the early 2000s, and that several agencies tried to build cases against him, but witnesses kept disappearing or refusing to cooperate. McCormick admits the case is bigger than he initially thought, and says he'll request the sealed court files related to adoptions processed through Family Connection Services. He warns us this could take weeks because the files are old, and the court moves slowly on these requests. Gilbert asks if there's any way to speed up the process, and McCormick says no, that we just have to wait for the legal system to do its job. I feel frustrated, but at least McCormick is finally taking this seriously, instead of acting like my parents just decided to take a vacation. 2 weeks pass, and I barely sleep during that entire time. Every night I lie awake thinking about my parents and wondering if someone will hurt them before we can expose the truth about the adoption network. I go to work, but I can't focus, and my boss asks if everything is okay because I keep making mistakes on simple tasks. Adeline calls me twice during those 2 weeks, and both times she sounds nervous. The first time she warns me that people are getting anxious about our investigation, and that I should be careful about who I trust. I ask her what people, and she says she can't give names, but that word is spreading that someone is digging into the old Family Connection Services cases. The second time she calls, she tells me to watch my back because she heard someone asking questions about me at a place where former network employees used to meet. I ask her if my parents are still safe, and she says as far as she knows they haven't been found, but that the situation is getting more dangerous as more people learn about the investigation. After each call, I feel sick with worry, and Gilbert tells me we're doing the right thing, but that doesn't make the waiting any easier. The court finally releases some of the sealed files, and McCormick calls me to come to the station to review them. When I arrive, he has boxes of documents spread across a conference table, and he looks tired like he's been reading through them for hours. The files show that over 40 adoptions were processed through Family Connection Services between 1998 and 2001, with irregular documentation and expedited approvals. McCormick points to my adoption file, and I see all the red flags that should have stopped the placement. The birth mother's information is obviously fake with an address that doesn't exist, and a signature that looks forged. My medical records from before the adoption are completely missing. The home study that was supposed to evaluate my parents as suitable adoptive parents is only 2 pages long when it should have been much more detailed. Every single document has problems, but they were all approved anyway. McCormick shows me the judge's signature on the final approval, and the name makes my stomach drop. Judge Patricia Keating signed off on my adoption, and on at least 15 other cases in these files, despite all the obvious problems with the paperwork. Gilbert takes photos of every document with the judge's signature, and then starts searching for information about Patricia Keating as soon as we leave the police station. He finds that she retired in 2002 right after Family Connection Services was shut down, and that she moved out of state shortly after her retirement. Gilbert tracks her through property records and voter registration, and discovers she's living in a retirement community in Arizona. He calls the community office and asks to speak with Patricia Keating, and when they transfer him, he puts on a friendly voice and tells her he's writing a book about family court history, and would love to interview her about her career. I listen on speaker as Judge Keating sounds pleased at first, and starts talking about her years on the bench. Gilbert asks general questions for a few minutes to keep her comfortable, and then casually mentions that he's particularly interested in her work with adoption cases and organizations like Family Connection Services. The line goes completely silent for several seconds, and then Judge Keating's voice changes from friendly to cold. She says she doesn't recall that organization, and that she handled hundreds of cases during her career. Gilbert presses gently and mentions Ramon Mercado's name and asks if she remembers working with him. Judge Keating immediately says she has to go and hangs up before Gilbert can ask anything else. He looks at me and says her reaction proves she knows exactly what we're investigating and that she's afraid of being exposed after all these years. A judge doesn't just hang up on someone writing a book unless they're trying to hide something. Gilbert says we now have evidence of judicial corruption connected to the adoption fraud, which makes this a much bigger case than just my parents disappearing. I call Isolda and tell her about Judge Keating's involvement, and she gets excited because this is the kind of evidence that could finally bring real consequences for the people who ran the adoption network. Isolda suggests we file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, now that we have proof of judicial corruption and ongoing extortion connected to the old adoption network. She explains that the AG's office has the power to investigate across multiple jurisdictions and can bring charges that local police can't. Isolda tells me she's been working on her article about the case and that she's ready to publish as soon as we give her permission. She thinks public pressure from the article will force officials to act quickly instead of letting the investigation drag on for years. Gilbert agrees that we should file the complaint and let Isolda publish her article because we've gathered enough evidence to protect ourselves, and hopefully protect my parents too. We spend the rest of the afternoon at Isolda's office helping her fact-check every detail in her article and making sure we have documentation for every claim she's making. The next day, I meet with a lawyer named Opal Norton who specializes in adoption fraud and identity correction cases. Isolda recommended her and said she's helped other people who discovered their adoptions were illegal. Opal's office is small but organized with file cabinets full of case documents and a wall covered in certificates and awards. She sits across from me and reviews all our evidence carefully, taking notes and asking questions about specific details. After about an hour, she looks up and tells me that proving my adoption was fraudulent won't invalidate my legal identity as an adult. She explains that I've lived as this person for 27 years, and that the law recognizes my established identity regardless of how it was originally created. But she says I'll need to go through a process to correct my birth records and potentially establish my biological origins if I want complete legal clarity. Opal walks me through the steps, which involve petitioning the court, getting DNA testing, and possibly searching for my biological parents if I want to know where I really came from. Opal then addresses the threats that made my parents disappear, and she says the extortion is probably based on empty threats, rather than real legal power. She explains that challenging an adult adoption after 25 years would be extremely difficult legally, and that most judges wouldn't even consider it without extraordinary circumstances. She thinks whoever is threatening families from the old adoption network is counting on their fear and ignorance about the law, rather than having any actual ability to follow through. Opal says the threatener probably knows that scared parents won't consult lawyers and will just pay money or stay hidden to protect their children. She tells me this is common in fraud cases where the criminals continue to profit from their old crimes by exploiting the victim's ongoing fear. Hearing this makes me feel angry because it means my parents ran away based on threats that probably couldn't have been carried out anyway. I feel some relief knowing I won't lose my identity or be taken away from my life, but I'm still furious that my parents disappeared based on empty threats instead of trusting me with the truth. Opal sees my face and says she understands my anger, but that fear makes people act in ways that don't make sense when you look at them logically. She explains that my parents probably thought they were protecting me by running away and keeping me in the dark, even though their actions ended up causing more harm than the truth would have. Opal says this is a pattern she sees in a lot of fraud cases, where victims make bad decisions because they're operating from a place of panic instead of getting proper legal advice. She tells me that when we find my parents, I should try to remember that they acted out of love, even if their choices were wrong, and that rebuilding trust will take time, but is possible if everyone is willing to be honest going forward. I leave Opal's office feeling like I finally understand the legal reality of my situation, but the emotional reality of my parents' betrayal still sits heavy in my chest, and I don't know how long it will take before I can forgive them for choosing to abandon me, instead of facing this together. The next morning, Gilbert and I meet Opal at her office, and we spend 3 hours putting together the formal complaint with every piece of evidence we've collected. Opal prints out copies of the adoption papers and the financial records and the sealed court files and organizes everything into a thick folder with tabs marking each section. She writes a cover letter explaining the fraud network and the current extortion and how my parents disappeared because of threats, and she includes a timeline showing how everything connects from 1999 to now. We drive downtown to the Attorney General's office and hand everything to a clerk who stamps it received and says someone will be in touch. Walking out, I feel like we just lit a fuse, but I don't know how long it will take to explode. 2 days later, I get a call from the AG's office, and a woman tells me they're assigning 2 investigators to review the complaint, and that they'll need to interview everyone involved. Over the next week, I sit through 3 separate interviews where the investigators ask me the same questions different ways, and take notes on everything I say. They interview Gilbert at his office, and Henry at the diner, and Adeline at Opal's office, with Opal sitting right next to her the whole time. Each interview lasts hours, and by the end, I'm exhausted from repeating my story and answering questions about details I barely remember. Adeline calls me after her first interview, and she's crying and saying she can't do this because she's going to get arrested for being part of the adoption network. I tell her to talk to Opal, and she says she already did, but she's still scared because she helped move money and paperwork for Ramon 25 years ago, even if she didn't know exactly what it was for. Opal calls me an hour later and says she's working on getting Adeline immunity in exchange for her testimony about how the network operated. She explains that Adeline's role was small, and she was young, and probably didn't understand what she was really doing, and that prosecutors care more about getting the people who ran the network than punishing minor players who can help build the case. 3 days later, Opal calls with good news and says the AG's office agreed to give Adeline immunity if she testifies about Ramon and the other people involved and provides documentation about the courier system they used. Adeline agrees, and I can hear the relief in Opal's voice when she tells me that having a witness from inside the network makes the whole case much stronger. The AG investigators call me in for one more meeting, and this time they bring Opal with me, and we sit in a conference room with folders spread across the table. The lead investigator tells us they're opening a full investigation into Family Connection Services and all the related organizations that Ramon ran during the late 90s and early 2000s. He says they'll be contacting other families who use the network to see if anyone else wants to cooperate or file complaints, and that they're also looking at the judges and social workers who helped process the fraudulent adoptions. I ask how long this will take, and he says probably months or even years, because they need to build cases against multiple people and gather evidence that will hold up in court. He warns us not to expect quick results or dramatic arrests, and says most of these investigations move slowly because they're complicated and involve people who covered their tracks carefully. I leave feeling glad something is finally happening, but also frustrated that it could take years before anyone faces real consequences. Isolde calls me the next day and says her article is ready to publish, and asks if I'm okay with her using my story as the main example of how the adoption fraud network operated and how families are still being hurt by it today. I tell her yes because I want people to know what happened, and maybe it will help other families come forward if they were part of the same network. She publishes the article 3 days later in a big newspaper, and by that evening it's been picked up by national news sites and TV stations. My phone starts ringing constantly with reporters wanting to interview me and asking for more details about my parents' disappearance and the adoption fraud. I let most calls go to voicemail because I don't know what to say, and Opal told me to stay quiet until the AG investigation moves forward. The attention is overwhelming, and I have to turn my phone off for hours at a time just to get some peace. 3 days after Isolde's article goes viral, my phone rings with a number I don't recognize, and when I answer, my mother's voice says my name. She sounds different this time, less like she's reading a script and more desperate and real. She tells me she's sorry for leaving and that she and my father made terrible mistakes, but that they always loved me and tried to give me a good life, despite how I came into their family. Her voice breaks when she says this, and I can tell she's crying. I start crying too because hearing her voice makes everything real again, and I realize how much I've missed her even though I'm angry about what she did. She says they saw Isolde's article and they know the investigation is happening and they're scared about what comes next, but they're glad the truth is finally coming out. I'm crying and angry at the same time, and I tell my mother that loving me wasn't enough if they couldn't trust me with the truth. I say that disappearing hurt me more than any news about my adoption could have, because at least the truth would have been something we could face together. She's quiet for a minute, and then she says they were afraid I would hate them if I knew they bought me from people who stole babies, or took them from mothers who didn't have a choice. I tell her I'm more hurt by the lies and by them running away than by finding out my adoption was illegal, because the lies made me question everything about my childhood, and whether any of it was real. She says she understands, and that they should have trusted me, but fear makes you do things that don't make sense when you look back on them. I tell her that's what Opal said too, but it doesn't make the hurt go away. My mother gives me a phone number where I can reach them and says they're staying with old friends in a different state until they know it's safe to come home. She won't tell me exactly where they are, but she says the friends are people they've known for 30 years who understand the situation. I write down the number with shaking hands and tell her I need time to process everything before I decide whether I want to see them in person. She says she understands and that they'll wait as long as it takes, and that she just needed me to know they're alive and they love me. After we hang up, I sit on my couch staring at the phone number and wondering if I should call them back or wait, or just throw the paper away. Gilbert comes over that evening and I show him the phone number my mother gave me. He takes a picture of it and says he can trace it to find out where they're actually staying. I tell him to go ahead because I need to know they're really safe, and not just saying that to make me feel better. He works on his laptop for an hour, running searches and making calls to contacts he has in different states, and finally he tells me the number traces to a small town in Oregon. He calls Detective McCormick and explains the situation, and McCormick agrees to contact the local police there to do a welfare check. 2 days later, McCormick calls me back and says the Oregon police confirmed my parents are alive and staying voluntarily with friends at a house outside of town. He says they talked to both my parents and verified they're not being held against their will or in any immediate danger, and that they told the police they left because of threats related to an old legal matter. The AG investigators call my parents directly after getting their contact information from McCormick. They interview my mother and father separately by phone, and both conversations last over 2 hours, according to what the investigators tell me later. My parents provide detailed information about Ramon and the other people who ran Family Connection services, including names and descriptions, and how the payment system worked. They admit they paid $40,000 for my adoption through a series of cashier's checks made out to cash, and that they knew the paperwork seemed irregular, but they were too desperate for a child to ask too many questions. The investigators tell me this information matches what Adeline said and what they're finding in the old financial records, which means they're building a solid case against Ramon and possibly some of the other people involved. 2 weeks after my parents' interviews, Ramon is arrested at his home in another state on charges of adoption fraud and extortion, and something called racketeering that has to do with running criminal networks over long periods of time. The arrest makes national news, and suddenly everyone wants to talk about gray market adoptions and the families affected by these schemes. I see Ramon's picture on the news and he looks older than I expected. Just a regular guy in his 60s being walked out of his house in handcuffs. Reporters are talking about how his network placed over 100 babies during the 90s and early 2000s, and how many of those families probably have no idea their adoptions were illegal. My phone rings constantly again with reporters wanting my reaction to the arrest, but I still don't answer because Opal says the investigation is ongoing, and anything I say could affect the case. The news about Judge Keating breaks 3 days later when prosecutors announce charges against her for corruption and abuse of office related to the fraudulent adoptions. Her lawyers release a statement saying she plans to cooperate fully and negotiate a plea deal, which makes me sick because it means she'll probably avoid serious prison time, despite destroying so many families. Opal calls me after the announcement and says seeing these people finally face consequences helps validate what happened to us, that it wasn't just paranoia or overreaction, but real criminal activity that hurt real people. I appreciate her saying that, but I still feel angry that it took 25 years and my parents disappearing for anyone to take this seriously. Adeline contacts me a week later through a number I don't recognize and tells me she's entering witness protection because she's received threats after testifying against Ramon and identifying other people in the network. Her voice sounds scared and tired, and she says she wanted to call before she disappeared to thank me for helping her find the courage to tell the truth. I tell her I'm the one who should be thanking her for being the first person to confirm my parents were alive when everyone else thought I was crazy. She says she hopes I find peace with everything, and then the line goes dead, and I know I'll probably never hear from her again. Opal and I start the legal process to correct my birth records the next week, and it's more complicated than I expected because we have no idea who my biological parents were or where I was actually born. She files petitions with the court to unseal all records related to my placement and to conduct DNA testing that might identify my origins through genetic databases. The paperwork feels endless, and every form asks questions I can't answer about my real birthday, or birth location, or family medical history. My parents start calling every few days from Oregon, and the conversations are awkward and painful as they apologize over and over while I try to process decades of lies mixed with genuine love. I tell my father during one call that I'm not ready to see them in person yet, but that I don't hate them, and he starts crying and says he understands. I explain to my mother during another call that I need time to figure out who I am, separate from the identity they constructed for me, and she says she wants that for me too, even though it hurts to hear. The DNA testing takes 6 weeks to process, and Opal gets the results entered into several databases that match adoptees with biological relatives. Within a month, I get a notification about a potential half-sibling match in another state, and my hands shake as I read the email. Opal helps me make contact through the database's messaging system, and I learn I have a sister named Maria, who was also placed through a gray market adoption network around the same time as me. We exchange photos and phone numbers and set up a video call for the following weekend. Meeting Maria through the screen is surreal because we have the same nose and similar eyes, but completely different haircuts and styles and ways of talking. She tells me she only found out about her fraudulent adoption 2 years ago, when her adoptive mother died, and she found papers in a safety deposit box. She's been going through her own process of correcting her records and searching for the truth about where she came from. We talk for 3 hours that first call, and bond over the shared experience of discovering our families built our lives on fraud and lies. She says it helps to know someone else understands what it feels like to have your entire identity questioned. Detective McCormick calls me a few days after I meet Maria and asks if he can stop by my apartment to talk. I agree reluctantly, and when he arrives, he looks uncomfortable and won't quite meet my eyes at first. He tells me he wants to apologize for dismissing my concerns when I first reported my parents missing and for not taking the evidence seriously enough. He admits he made assumptions about my mental state and the situation that weren't fair or professional. He says working this case taught him not to assume people are being paranoid when they report something that seems unlikely, and that he's already changing how he handles missing persons cases based on what he learned. I appreciate the apology even though it doesn't undo the weeks I spent terrified and alone while he treated me like I was overreacting. 6 months after my parents first disappeared, they finally come home to Oregon, and we arranged to meet at their house with Opal present as a neutral mediator. I drive there on a Saturday morning and my stomach is in knots the entire 3-hour trip. When I walk in the door, my mother starts crying immediately, and my father looks like he's aged 10 years. We sit in their living room and Opal facilitates the conversation as we talk through everything that happened. My parents explain how desperate they were to have a child after years of failed fertility treatments and miscarriages, and how Ramon presented the adoption as a legitimate if unconventional option. They described their gradual realization that they'd gotten involved in something illegal, but by then they loved me so much they felt trapped. My mother says they knew removing those photos from the album was wrong, but they panicked when they heard about the investigation. My father admits they should have trusted me with the truth instead of running, but the threat about challenging my adoption terrified them into thinking disappearing was the only way to protect me. I tell them I forgive them for the adoption fraud because they were victims of Ramon's scheme too, just like the biological parents who were coerced or deceived into giving up their babies. But I also tell them I'm still hurt by their decision to disappear, instead of trusting me with the truth about my origins. We all cry as we talk through the betrayal and the love and the fear that motivated everyone's choices. Opal suggests family therapy to work through everything and rebuild trust, and my parents agree immediately. My father promises they'll never lie to me again, no matter how difficult the truth might be, and my mother says she'll answer any questions I have about what she remembers from the adoption process. Opal successfully petitions the court 3 months later to correct my birth records and establish a legal identity that acknowledges the fraudulent adoption while protecting my rights as an adult. I receive new documents that list my birth date as unknown and my birth location as unknown, but confirm my legal existence and citizenship through other means. The Social Security office issues me a new card with my existing number, but updated documentation explaining the irregular circumstances. It feels like a strange compromise to have official papers that essentially say, I don't know where I came from, but Opal assures me this protects me legally while telling the truth about my situation. Maria calls me twice a week and we meet for coffee every Saturday morning at a place halfway between our apartments. We compare notes on our lawyers and the paperwork we're each filing to correct our records and establish our real identities. She's 3 months ahead of me in the process because she started earlier, so she walks me through what to expect when different agencies ask for documentation I don't have. We talk about our parents and how weird it feels to love people who lied about something so big, and she gets it in a way nobody else can because she's living the same strange reality. One Saturday, she brings up the idea of doing DNA testing to try to find our biological parents, and I feel my stomach tighten at the thought of more revelations and more strangers. We agree we're not ready yet, and that we need time to deal with everything we've already learned before adding more complicated family connections to sort through. Maria says our relationship as sisters matters regardless of what else we find out, and I realize she's become one of the most important people in my life, even though we only met 6 months ago. I drive to my parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon and let myself in with the key I've had since high school. My mother is in the kitchen making tea, and my father is reading the newspaper at the table, and the scene looks so normal it makes my chest hurt. I put the key on the counter and tell them I need to return it because I can't keep coming and going like nothing changed between us. My mother starts to cry, and my father looks down at his newspaper, and I explain that I still love them, but I need limits while we figure out how to rebuild trust after everything that happened. Before I leave, I go to the living room and open the photo album where the 1999 pictures used to be. I carefully remove one of the small corner holders that used to attach a photo to the page and slip it into my pocket. My mother watches from the doorway and asks why I want it, and I tell her it's a reminder that truth matters more than comfortable lies, even when the truth is harder to live with. Life settles into a new routine over the following months with therapy appointments every Thursday and legal paperwork arriving in the mail every few weeks. Opal helps me work through the court system to get my corrected documents, and each new form feels like a small step toward owning my real identity, instead of the one that was created for me. Family dinners happen once a month at my parents' house, and they're awkward and sometimes painful, but we keep showing up because that's what rebuilding looks like. My parents answer my questions about the adoption when I ask them, and they don't try to justify what they did or make excuses about being desperate for a child. I'm learning to accept that some things about where I came from will never have answers, and that the mystery of my biological parents might stay a mystery forever. But I get to decide who I am now and what my life means, and that feels like enough. So there you have it, another heartwarming tale of a dementia patient stalking a toddler, because the system took forever to do anything about it. Nothing concerning here at all. Subscribe if you too enjoy stories that make you want to never leave your house again. So there you have it, another heartwarming tale of a dementia patient stalking a toddler, because the system took forever to do anything about it. Nothing concerning here at all. Subscribe if you too enjoy stories that make you want to never leave your house again.